Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sherry Horn Hassan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on November 10th, 2022 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. Before I get into today's content, today's astro news you can use, let me bore you with some of my usual housekeeping stuff and a new announcement. So the first is to tell you that you can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand banner labeled podcast. And from there you can scroll down the page, hear the most recent show, and or search the archived listings for past shows that you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. The show drops every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. So again, you can listen live or you can listen anytime. And while you're on that page, you'll see above the most recently posted show a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy. And that is some advice from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest, who is one of my very important mentors, that tells everybody in a very general way what you need to keep your particular individual sun sign happy. And again, that's based on an interview I did with Stephen a couple years ago, and he gave me permission to fashion it into a PDF that I can distribute to whomever I want. Downloading this document will sign you up for my weekly Conversations About Consciousness astrology newsletter, but you can, of course, unsubscribe anytime. So be sure to grab how to keep your sun sign happy, when you're listening to this podcast or any other time you might go to my website. It's on the main page as well. And enjoy, as I said, some words of astrological wisdom from Stephen Forrest. Now, separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul. Keep track of the upcoming content of podcasts, search for old podcasts, but they're all available at the same link on karmicevolution.com. I'm on Instagram now too, so you'll see posts there from me as well. And I am still, as many of you may have already heard, offering my 1-hour discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading to listeners only for only $99. So if you're interested in astrology, you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart or your natal horoscope, and how it is essentially a snapshot of the exact position of the planets at the precise moment and location of your birth, this reading reveals a great deal about you, especially when you choose to use it as a tool for soul growth. So if you want to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, if you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back in areas of importance to you, like your relationships, your career, your finances, or your health, then this Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for listeners only can really lead you to understand and then heal old karmic wounds and help you to co-create your own future happiness and success. So again, that's my 1 hour, $99 discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for listeners only, and at almost half the regular price. Conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. So you can find this offer at karmicevolution.com/karmic99. And finally, the Astrological Society of Princeton, of which I am a member and a board member, is taking signups for my new evolutionary astrology class, which is titled Fate, Free Will, and Your Soul's Evolution. And this class is for those of you who want to read charts from an evolutionary perspective and learn the truth about past karma and your soul's evolution. And during this 8-week class, you'll learn how to decipher and synthesize how the nodes in the chart, by sign, house, and aspects, as well as the sign, house, and aspects to and from the rulers of both the north and south nodes, tell one's life story, both past and present. So this class can help you move from chaos to clarity and weave such a story through astrological insight about your soul's true purpose in this lifetime. Sounds familiar, right? That's what my reading is about too. So if you want to learn how to do this for yourself or for others, that's what this class is about. Also help you gain insight about what's blocking you now based on past, what I call soul conditioning, and then how understanding all this allows you to overcome blockages and succeed, again, in areas of importance to you: relationships, career, finances, and or your health. So if you'd like to read your own and or others' charts with a focus on how what seemed to be fated from the past can actually be overcome through free will in the future, then this class is for you. So the class is going to begin Monday, January 23rd of 2023. It'll be on Zoom. It'll take place from 7 to 8:30 p.m. on Monday nights, and it'll run for 8 weeks. Recordings will, of course, be available after the fact for anyone who can't make it or has to miss, a session or 2 or 3 or whatever. So for information, more information, and to sign up, please go to aspnj.org. That's for Astrological Society of Princeton, New Jersey, aspnj.org. And if you have any questions about the class, please feel free to email me at Sherry, SHERI, at karmicevolution.com, and I'd be happy to answer them. Okay, so now let's get into this week's Astro News you can use. Now, it's interesting because I think the anxiety of the Taurus full moon lunar eclipse from November 8th, which obviously was also midterm elections day here in the United States, that eclipse involved the Taurus moon Uranus conjunction, right, opposite the Scorpio sun, Mercury, and Venus. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this is a very anxiety-provoking time, right? And I think the anxiety is now beginning to wane 2 days past the eclipse. And, that's a good thing, right? We're starting to get results from the elections. I mean, most of them have been decided. I'm not going to go over in detail all of the results, but clearly, there are still 3 outstanding races in the Senate. The Senate is standing at 48 for the Democrats and 49 for the Republicans. We currently have a 50-50 balance, and any tie-breaking vote gets cast by the vice president because that is tradition. And the vice president in this case, Kamala Harris, is obviously part of the Democratic administration of President Biden. Therefore, when push comes to shove, if there's a tie in the Senate, it'll swing Democratic. So we're waiting to see what will happen. There is a runoff that will happen on December 6th and we'll look at that in the future, between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker in Pennsylvania. And meanwhile, the red wave, of course, didn't materialize, right? So one of the things I wanted to do briefly, or maybe not so briefly, is to take a look at where the recent eclipses fell in the U.S. Sibley Chart. And the data for that chart is July 4th, 1776 at 5:10 p.m. in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I wanted to look at it because I thought it would be interesting just to review, looking at the birth chart of this country and to determine some baseline stuff that people may or may not know, but that I think is important as a kind of historical information to then look at to see where we're going to go from here. So what I first want to talk about is the fact that the United States Sibley Chart has a 12 degree 21 minute Sag rising, and it has a Cancer moon in the 7th house at 13 degrees 19 minutes of Cancer, which is conjoined with Jupiter at 5 degrees 56 minutes of Cancer and Venus at 3 degrees 6 minutes of Cancer. Now, I use wide orbs, so some of you may say, whatever. But a Cancer stellium in the 7th house means that this nation, if we're looking at it in terms of its collective energy, right? It's not a person, but it's made up of persons, right? So we have both a collective and a collective consciousness and a collective unconscious. So the Cancerian nature of this country projects itself out onto other nations or other peoples and wants to nurture them, right? 7th house in psychological astrology is the house of projection. Now, the complicating factor in that stellium is that it is square or squared by Saturn in Libra in the 10th house. Now, when Saturn's in the 10th house, it's in its own natural house because Saturn's Capricorn naturally rules the 10th house. So we have, as most of us who grew up here or came here to study and learned about know, this country was born out of trauma of revolting against the father, king, authority figure, right? And the fact that we're born out of trauma is inherent in the evolutionary astrology interpretation of the South Node in Aquarius in the 2nd house. And that's kind of topped by the fact that Pluto is in that house natally at 27 degrees 33 minutes of Capricorn. And anyone who's been listening to this show or reading or listening to any other astrologers knows that we're still in the middle of a Pluto return, which happens once every 246 to 48 years. Okay? So, and we know that Pluto's soon to enter Aquarius in March of 2023. So let's go back to the beginning here, which is that this country was born out of the trauma and revolution, Aquarian nature, rebelling against the father authority tyranny of the monarchy in Britain, the king, and that was over the issue of resources, which is what the 2nd house represents. We also have the fact that Mercury from the 9th house in Cancer, opposes Pluto. So there can be a kind of obsessive nature in this country, all right? So the other big thing is that Mars in Gemini at 2122 in the 7th house squares Neptune in this U.S. natal chart at 2225 Virgo in the 9th house. Now that is, so what I want to say is we're born, right, fighters, resistors, I always remember learning early in probably elementary or junior high school that one of the reasons the soldiers won in the Revolutionary War is because we used guerrilla tactics. So we knew, the U.S. ragtag army, right, didn't have those bright red uniforms and come with drums and flutes and whatever and parade down the middle of the street where they could easily be shot or otherwise picked off. And they hid behind and in trees and bushes and fields and, all that kind of stuff. So the element of surprise. But we fought that battle, we won that battle, right? This nation is now having its first Pluto return, and it's well versed in going back and forth between bucking authority and also caring about others, right? So I think I don't need to say too much more. There's a lot of history that I don't know. I'm not a historian, but I'm just pointing out that this is a tension that we've always had, right? But meanwhile, the Mars square Neptune is a little bit more fantastical. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is that the United States tends to glorify heroes. And, one of the things that I think most people maybe haven't thought about, I don't know, is that, in years gone by, starting from the inception of this nation, when we appointed or elected George Washington, the first president of the U.S., that we, gave the presidency to many of our military heroes, generals and others, admirals and others who fought the good fight in whatever war throughout our history and then gained political status. We also gave prominent positions, the presidency and governorships and things like that, to prominent businessmen like the Rockefellers and the Kennedys, whose father, of course, was a bootlegger, but he still made a lot of money, and the Trumps, So that's where that obsession about resources comes in also, right? So we know that there's this dichotomy between bucking authority and caring, and then on top of that comes this worry or obsession about where's the money coming from? Are we going to have enough? Why are we in deficit? And the evolution of the austerity programs and the concern about running deficits and things like that. And what I wanted to say, too, is that the U.S. has a 27-degree, 10-minute Aquarius moon in the 3rd house. Now, that house is also, I think, among its other interpretations of communication and siblings and, near neighborhood, near family, like cousins and aunts and uncles. It represents trade. It represents local business and commerce. And so I think also, given the fact that this country was born rebelling against taxation on our tea, and said, well, why should we pay a tax that the monarchy has installed, and instead let's, I don't know for a fact, but I mean, the theory you would logically think we're not going to pay you the tax. If anyone's going to pay a tax, they're going to pay it to our state or our country. So we have this concern with trade here, which I think has been something that's been, a very large part of this country, especially once it came out of its isolationist stances in the 1800s or early 1900s and realized how much capital it could grow based on trade, right? So what I wanted to point out is that the United States Sibley Chart has just gone through a lunar return. Now, a lunar return, like monthly, the moon returns to its natal place in each of our individual charts or anything else that we're looking at, chart for anyone or anything else, every 27 and a half days. So we take that and extrapolate it to a progressed lunar return. We have 27 and a half years. For example, my son just turned, that's SON, 27 and a half in mid-October. And so he just had a lunar return. Okay? So if you track that, it's every 27 and a half to 28 years, and then again at around 54, and so on. So this is, the lunar return is an interesting time, and I'm going to read you something from Sophia Mason's book, The Delineation of Progressions, that I have here. And the lunar return, when the progressed moon conjoins the natal moon, which it is doing right now, its progressed moon is in effect when it meets or aspects a natal planet or point for approximately 3 months. That's the month before it hits the exact degree of the planet or angle or whatever, the month that it's exact, and the following month. So we're just coming out of that, because the progressed moon here is at 28:58, so we're a little bit past that. But I just noticed it recently. So again, Sophia Mason says this occurs at ages 28 and 56. I'm sorry, I said 54. For a female, this can be a dangerous aspect if the conjunction receives difficult aspects from other progressed planets or major transiting planets. This aspect will strongly react upon the house position of the natal moon and the house it rules in the natal chart. So the house position of the natal moon is that third house, communication, siblings, which would be probably in our case, things like the territories, Puerto Rico and Guam and other places that there would be like our relations, but they're not exactly full brothers and sisters. And trade, as I said, business and local trade. So the house that is the ruler of the house that's ruled by the moon is, in this particular chart, is the 8th house. Now, the 8th house is naturally ruled by Pluto, and so it has a Plutonic flavor to it. And when the moon, or you see the sign of Cancer on the cusp of the 8th house, I call that a Moon-Pluto combination, okay? So, again, it's sort of like, instead of, with the Sun square Saturn in the U.S. chart, we got issues with daddy, right? But with the moon ruling Pluto's natural house, we got some intense relationships with the mother. And so we could extrapolate out from both of those that whether it's mother or father, it doesn't really matter that much. Moon Pluto is in intense relationship with mother. The aspects, exact aspects, depending on whether they're frictional or easier, can define whether that intense relationship is positive or negative. But in this case, it's just a flavoring in this chart. And so the moon, having come to its progressed lunar return, which, by the way, happens in everyone's chart at around, like I said, 27.5 or 28, and is followed approximately 2.5 years later by their Saturn return. So the U.S. is gearing up for a Saturn return in about 2.5 years, and we'll talk more about that on another time. But to get back to the fact that the moon rules the 8th house, Sophia Mason says it does not have to concern the native, but rather a female relative in the immediate environment. Yet one should not take a risk and seek a complete physical checkup. Well, I think the Pluto return has caused us to engage in a complete physical checkup, and I think this most recent eclipse on November 8th, election day, would bear that out, right? It says in a male's chart it can be the wife or mother who will be of concern unless the native has a natal or progressed Cancer ascendant. So, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about that, because now the moon is going to go through the 3rd house. So as it entered the 3rd house at 24 degrees and 53 minutes of Aquarius, which was a few months back, and is now at 28:58 and has already passed over the natal moon at, as I said, 27:10 of Aquarius, we know that we are, in a situation where whether we consider this country male or female, it doesn't really matter, because both of them show us at the inception of this country issues, quote unquote, with both the feminine and the masculine. And according to Bernadette Brady's book, Predictive Astrology, The Eagle and the Lark, she talks about the progressed moon going through the 3rd house. She says, from the security of the 2nd house moon, you enter the 3rd house seeking knowledge or activity and wanting to express ideas. Movement, journeys, new forms of transportation, classes, and issues to do with siblings are highlighted. You'll be open to new ideas, willing to explore different methods of doing things, and you'll be restless and keen to communicate. Now, The third house is, of course, opposite the ninth house in anyone's chart. And the ninth house is, media. And it is also the house really of judgments, right? It's kind of like Jupiter is the law, and Saturn is the judge. So the 10th house is a little bit more the judge, but the ninth house is where the laws are derived from, right? 10th house is where people become prominent, and the 11th house is the legislature in mundane astrology. So I found it interesting that November 8th eclipse at 2 degrees of Scorpio landed on the progressed Saturn in the 11th house of the U.S. Sibley Chart. And that progressed Saturn is now at 2 degrees 51 minutes. So depending on the orb one wants to use, I think it's close enough. Well, 2 degrees to 251. I was thinking it was 1 degree. So anyway, it clearly has some kind of effect here, right? Because the natal Saturn's in the 10th house square to the sun. And the progressed Saturn has been for a few years in the 11th house of the legislature. So it doesn't surprise me that as we go through the lunar return, or we just went through the lunar return, there's a bit of a shift. The moon entered the third house. It's more about communication, whereas previously everyone's in their own little silos, right? Nobody wants to talk to another person because their mind is made up. But the legislature will remain a foundational entity because Saturn's in the 11th house by progression, but it's also opposing progressed Venus at 3 degrees 28 minutes in the 5th house. So there's this call, which I think anyone who has critical thinking capabilities understands in the United States, to define whether you are in whatever it is you do for self-gratification, and to really understand how to balance that with a sense of duty and obligation, right? So do you want to be in it just for the power and the money, because then you can buy Joe Manchin's yacht when he's tired of it? Or do you want to serve the people, because that's where you've determined your major obligation is as a person who's been elected by a constituency which has given you power? So the other part is that Mars has been transiting. It's now at right now at 2442 retrograde in Gemini in the United States 7th house, which again, remember, has natal Mars in that house, and it squares the natal Jupiter. But transiting Mars is squaring the natal Jupiter in the 9th house, which gives us our religious bent. 9th house is also the house of religion, Jupiter's domain. And it more closely has squared the progressed Neptune at 2557. So this glorification I was talking about of heroes, and what I've started to say and probably didn't finish, is that over the last 40 or so years, we've moved from electing our generals, General Eisenhower, and all these, so I said the capitalists and the military people, towards electing movie stars and celebrities from TV, etc. So we have J.D. Vance, who just got elected, who was an author. He came to prominence because he wrote a book. We have Trump, who obviously was on TV for several years, who had already made a name for himself, but when he was on TV, he really had exposure to the rest of the country. Most of us from the New York area knew him, but now everyone knows him, right? And there's a multitude of other people, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and of course Ronald Reagan, who I feel started that whole parade. So because the United States has always been affiliated with that Horatio Alger kind of mythic story, right? Someone's going to come along and save us. The Mars square Neptune, which I have already pointed out in previous podcasts, is very fantasy prone. And it's also, I think, the reason we've got Mars in the 7th house projecting out our sexuality onto others, squaring Neptune in the 9th house, which is religious, where we see all these sexual scandals coming out of first the Catholic Church and the evangelicals, and even, I mean, it doesn't really matter. I'm not picking on them. I think it exists in any fundamentalist type, religion, or in religion that seeks to indoctrinate people. So it's just the Catholic Church has and had wielded a huge amount of power. And in certain areas, the evangelical church does as well. So again, I'm not singling only them out, but there's the Islamic belief that if you die a martyr, you're going to go to heaven and get whatever it is, 27, 33. I don't know what the magic number is. Amount of virgins. And then there have, of course, been not plenty, but there have been sex scandals in the Jewish community as well. So I'm not naming anyone specifically. You guys know what I'm talking about, so I'm not going to belabor that point. But my point is that we're having a recurrence in this U.S. chart of the Mars having made its Mars return previously, not long ago, to the 7th house natal Mars, and triggering that square. Right, so we have a tension between saying, where can we be, how can we fulfill our fantasies without using fantasy and blaming other people and all that kind of stuff? Because when you have Mars in the 7th house, you may tend to project your anger. You repress your anger, and the anger comes at you from other people, right? But you also repress your sexuality, and then people come at you with hypersexual fantasies or whatever. All right, that's just me riffing it. I'm pretty much riffing it today because I just intuitively felt like I had to just talk without a lot of prepared notes so I could look at the charts and just give you what I see. But that I think the fact that the eclipse on election day just a mere 2 days ago fell on the Saturn, as we still have in the sky, the Saturn square Uranus. It's waning now, but it's still within about, Saturn's at 1852, Uranus is at retrograde at 1651, so they're 2 degrees apart now, right? But Saturn, as the Greek myth goes, and I said this a long time ago when I was talking about the original exact square between these two during 2021, that Saturn always emerges victorious. I'm not going to go through the whole myth again, but basically, Uranus or Uranus, who is the sky god, lay with Gaia, who is the Mother Earth, disliked the children that she produced, was horrified by their appearance, and sought to stuff them back in his womb until Gaia said no, and she had others help her to squirrel away Saturn so that he didn't get stuck in her womb. And as he grew up, he came back and he essentially castrated Uranus so that he could no longer reproduce, threw his genitals into the ocean from the foam from which sprang Aphrodite, who is the Roman Venus that we use in our charts now. So there's a whole mythology about that, but then Saturn becomes the ruler for a long time, and it was known as the golden years. And so the foundation, stayed. And I had said a long time ago that I think the foundation will remain. And right now, post-election, in these early days, we have a lot of people pointing fingers at, the Democrats there's a section that's too progressive, and of course there's a sect of the Republican or GOP groups that are too, crazy. I mean, they're crazy restrictive, as noted in the abortion issue. So the abortion issue is a perfect example of this eclipse hitting the progressed Saturn in the 11th house of the legislature, as it's opposing Venus in the 5th house, which is, of course, children. It's creativity, it is romance, and it's children. And Venus in this chart, progressed Venus, is in Taurus, which is physical of the body. So how uncanny is it that the eclipse hits Saturn and it says, look, is this about your duty and obligation to others, or is this just about you getting, powerful and hoarding all the money because Saturn's in Scorpio, right? And in a 11th house powerful position if you're in the legislature. So it doesn't surprise me. The fact that we're entering a new progressed moon phase, we're starting the next 27 and a half years, says that, in Aquarius, with that moon ruling the 8th house, I'm sorry, but F you. You are not taking away my bodily autonomy. Now we fast forward and say, I'm sorry, that was the October, I'm confused because I'm winging it today, so forgive me. The 2-degree Scorpio eclipse was on October 24th, and we also, October 25th, and we also know that a lot of people voted early. So, but that was a huge, huge consideration, as every single news outlet is telling you now. Polling be damned, whether it was in the polls or not. And on November 8th, the United States Sibley Chart took the 16-degree Taurus lunar eclipse in opposition to Hygeia at 1615 Scorpio, where? In the 11th house. So health became an issue. Power, empowerment over your own health became an issue that people didn't want legislated or wanted legislated in their favor of bodily autonomy. And here progressed Hygeia, who is the goddess asteroid of health and healing, the daughter of Asclepius, who is known as the father of modern medicine, is opposing Vesta. Vesta in the 5th house as well in Taurus. Vesta is the keeper of the hearth flame, hearth fire. Vesta is the priestess beholden to no man. So again, these two things with the sun and the Uranus and the moon close to Vesta in the 5th house, opposing the sun, Venus, and Mercury in Scorpio, close to the Hygeia, opposing natally Vesta, right? She represents our valuables, the things we put in our safety deposit box, the things that we hold dearest, the deed to our house, the title to our car, our will. Okay, that's what she is representative of, amongst other things. She's also a sibling signature, as in sisters. So the sisterhood said, when triggered by this eclipse on November 8th, F no, ain't gonna happen. And prior to that, with the October 25th hitting the 2-degree Scorpio, hitting that Saturn smack on, which opposes the progressed Venus, is opposed by, is where does my duty lie? Where do I need to stand up, not just for myself selfishly, but for others? So I think we saw that, and that's pretty loud and pretty clear. Now, I just wanted to add, before I get off the topic of the Sibley chart, that the way that I calculate an elemental and modal mix, which is something I gave a lecture about a while back at the Astrological Society of Princeton, and I may repeat sometime soon, is that there is a psychological technique that I got from an astrologer named Richard Eidemann, who wrote a book on the subject called The Magic Thread. But it defines the dominant function. So when I calculate the mix here for the United States of America Sibley chart, it comes out the dominant function of cardinal water, which is Cancer, which is the chart's sun. Now, that doesn't always happen every time, but it's just interesting to note, all right? So we're aware of our Cancerian tendencies. However, inferior function, which is a term coined by Carl Jung, lies below consciousness, and it's designated by having either one or no planets in a particular element or modality. So we come out with zero fire. And if anyone was listening last week, you remember that I said these eclipses had either one or no fire in them. On October 25th, we had Jupiter retrograding back from Aries, and that was the only planet in fire during that time. And then, of course, there was no fire by November 8th. So the lack of fire, which I talked about also last week, is a lack of energy. It can be depression, but it can also make it, because it's based on us feeling helpless, out in the world. And that can cause us, the repression of that energy causes rage and aggression. And it can also manifest as obsession. It can manifest as mania, and the mania that it takes is sort of like in love with being in love. So there is that kind of energy in the natal chart here in America with the Mars square Neptune, right? Oh, everything's going to be all right. We're going to find a hero, and he's going to save us, the white knight, or the knight on the white horse. So combined with the lack of fire in the sky at the time, I think there was a lot of movement and a lot of people either checked out or energized, right? We got to do this, got to do this, got to do this, got to do this. And when the other inferior function is that the United States Sibley Chart has only one planet in fixed sign, and that's the moon. So again, I discussed that the moon rules the 8th house, which makes it pretty powerful. I mean, that's a very emotional, it's an emotional energy. But what happens is, the way that Richard Eidemann explains it is that inferior function erupts into consciousness during certain times. And many of us can identify that through our dream world, especially when we were young. However, he says inertia is a key word when fixed is an inferior function. And this, again, is the moon. It's our emotions, right? So we seek stability through things like hoarding or holding on to. It can manifest as an obsession, or what he calls an idea fixe, which is sometimes as an intense sexual passion or obsession with someone who's completely unavailable, like a rock star or other celebrity. But that feeds, in my mind, into also the idealization or idolization of our quote-unquote heroes. And so there's a lot of fantasy involved in that, where people do not look at the reality. I think perhaps Herschel Walker in Pennsylvania is a perfect example of that, so I don't think I have to say much more. And then he talks about hysterical paralysis. And again, I think because of the eclipses hitting the points that I just discussed in the Sibley Chart, the hysterical paralysis was overcome by a major portion of the female population and the men who support them to go out and take an action. I'd like to add one other point about, which just came to me, about the progressed lunar return in the Sibley chart, which is that it began about probably 4 months ago or so, and if I'm not mistaken, it probably correlates to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Bill. No, I'm sorry. The bill that has all of the infrastructure projects in it. I'm not sure now if that's the same one, but that this lunar return would probably be a new beginning, because in the 3rd house, right, we're talking about local transportation and the fact that the federal government has pumped a lot of money into fixing, repairing, or replacing highways, roads, bridges, tunnels, and all that sort of thing in order to make local commerce easier, right? You need to get your shipments from the ports come into the cities put them in warehouses, the warehouses have trucks that come and take them to your local community and fill your big box stores or your grocery stores or whatever. So we won't talk about the price of gas or transportation costs. So I wanted to talk briefly about Donald Trump's chart. I know I advertised Nancy Pelosi and Brittney Griner, and I do want to get into them, and I may not have enough time today because I've kind of wandered around in a little spacey way. Something's going on, so my brain is just going, go with it. Anyway, I noticed, which I thought was really interesting, that his progressed moon, because it seems to be a progressed moon kind of day, right, is actually on his Chiron and his Juno, and is approaching his natal Jupiter. So I've talked about that before, in his second house. And they are now saying on the news that, hang on a second, let me just find it here, because, I was listening to Keith Olbermann, and in a little short blurb that he had today, he's got a new podcast apparently. He said the New York Post headline, and reminded everyone that the New York Post is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who, of course, in Fox News has been, Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson. They just love Trump, blah, blah, blah. The headline says Humpty Trumpty, and another calls him Toxic Trump, and another article says he should move on from politics, and that GOP Congressman Peter King said that Trump should, quote, no longer be the face of the Republican Party. So I found it interesting when looking at his chart. I noticed that he took the 2-degree Scorpio October 25th eclipse on his 1-degree 27-minute progressed Scorpio ascendant. And that made me start thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? Because in combination with his progressed moon, which just is still, just went over in the last month, 2 months or so, 3 months or so, his progressed Mars, they're in Libra in the second house, but that progressed moon, like I said, is exact on Juno and Chiron, which is where a lot of his mooning goes. It comes from, and Jupiter there too. It's going to be on Jupiter exact in a few months. But here we have a change with the eclipse hitting his progressed ascendant, which falls in the third house, a change in the way that people perceive him, because that's what the ascendant is. It shows, you're showing to the world who you are, whether what you're showing is true or not. It's still going to affect the way that people perceive you. So I thought that was a very interesting thing to mention. I think also the fact that right now today, transiting Neptune is retrograde at 2247 of Pisces in Trump's 7th house of partnership, and almost exact square his 2255 Gemini sun in his 10th house. And that Neptune is being squared by the retrograde Mars at 2442 today, which is going to be coming back to hit his sun again, and his North Node and his Uranus. I've said before that his chart is very lucky, but the point I want to make is that I think people are now beginning to see through what I call his dementia, right? Because I think he's always been narcissistic, etc. But now it's sort of like all the stuff that he started with the big lie and the hoax and the election fraud stuff. We're starting to come down. That's what it feels like, right? Everybody's coming down from the anxiety of the Uranian influence of this last eclipse and starting to breathe a sigh of relief and starting to look at things more realistically. The Republicans are regrouping right now to see whether they're going to be duking it out, which a lot of pundits predict on the liberal side, that this is, the beginning of a war now between the internalization in the GOP party about who's going to stay with Trump and who's not, like Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever. Anyway, I wanted to point that out because I do believe, personally, for Trump, it's related to increasing dementia. And it also, the Neptune has squared his moon. So, both luminaries are taking a hit, and he's just living in fantasy world, right? So the rest of the country, especially at the end of this lunar return, in Aquarius is going, wait a minute, that just doesn't match the facts, finally. So there's some hope. Now, I want to touch briefly on Nancy Pelosi's chart. As I said, her birth data is March 26, 1940 at 3:10 p.m. in Baltimore, Maryland. And what I see here is that her progressed moon has just entered her 4th house. And a description of that, I think, is best summed up by, again, Sophia Mason's book called Delineation of Progressions, in which she says, Cancer and the 4th house are cardinal in nature, stressing ambition and action. However, the nurturing nature of Cancer does not want to achieve success at the expense of family. Therefore, a business enterprise is possible, but one that will fit in with family schedules. Old and pending matters are often resolved and come to an end, making way for new beginnings. When the progressed moon enters the fourth house or Cancer, all matters pertaining to domestic affairs, apparent, and property are activated. Moving to a new location is possible, while others may enlarge or redecorate the present home. There is a change of moods and temperament, causing the emotions to undergo a very trying period. And that, I think, pretty much fits the bill for Nancy Pelosi because, again, this moon just moved in. Her cusp of her fourth house is 22-24. So a little over a month and a half ago, if her progressed moon is at 23-56, it moved into the fourth house. And what happens? Somebody breaks in part because her progressed moon is now exact opposite. Again, the progressed moon, 23-56 Scorpio, opposite progressed Uranus at 23-58 of Taurus, which is in her 10th house and close to her midheaven. Right? So she is now saying that she may consider stepping down from Congress. Now, nothing concrete has happened, but I just want to point that out because I do think that the other thing here is that the 16-degree Taurus eclipse on November 28th fell in opposition by 2 degrees to her natal moon, which is 18 degrees 0 minutes of Scorpio, right outside the fourth house in the third, depending on how you want to read it. It's about 4.5 degrees from the fourth house cusp. So either way, something shocking pertaining to the fourth house related to the career has happened, and Mars is now retrograde in her 10th house, sitting on top of, or had just about reached and then retrograded on her 2605 progressed Gemini sun. So I just wanted to point that out because I do think, she's probably going to retreat from public life quite a bit. Transiting Uranus is at 1651 retrograde in her 9th house right now. And again, the cusp of her 10th house is 2224 of Taurus. So Uranus will take a while to get there, and when it gets there, it's going to retrograde back and forth. So we're looking at the next 1.5 to 2 years with her. Now, she's also born in 1940, so she's 82, right? So it's not like it would be unexpected for someone that age to retire. However, look at Chuck Grassley, who just got reelected senator of his state at the age of 89. And look at Biden saying that he's going to run again in 2024 when he'll be more like 80. So, it's an interesting topic that will take up another time. But I thought it was worth, looking at here. And the the transiting Mars, which again is retrograde now at 24, when it comes back in January to station direct, and then in March to hit the degree again at which it's station direct, which was 2532, I think it was, of Gemini, it'll start to sextile her ascendant at 2759 of Leo. So, we're keeping an eye on that, and we'll see what happens as, time progresses. Meanwhile, again, it's easy to get the numbers about where the Senate and the House stand now. I'll just point out that the House has a total of 435 seats, 3 of which are vacant, and there are different projections. One party has to get 218 seats to have majority control. So as the United States chart shows, inherent in its nature is a couple of things to get blown out of proportion, to feel restricted with that Sun-Saturn natal energy, but also to feel a little bit arrogant with Sun, Jupiter, and Venus saying, oh, we could be so generous to give things to other countries and people. Look at what's brewing with if the GOP takes control of either the House or the Senate, and the House is known as having the purse strings. How Marjorie Taylor Greene has already said that she wants to cut off funding to Ukraine, right? So, but meanwhile, as I said, I didn't really touch on this before, but Sun Jupiter is hubristic, right? Where we can criticize others with the Sun Saturn, but ignore our own faults. And that's a flaw in our psychological makeup, but it's one that we were born with. So I just want to leave you all with that. I hope that next week brings better news on the congressional front, and we can turn to other things as Mercury and Venus are going to be moving into Sagittarius this week. No, is it this week or next week? Hang on. Yeah, Venus enters Sagittarius on November 15th and 15th or 16th, depending on your time zone. And on the 17th, Mercury enters Sagittarius. I need to go take a nap, and it's only noon here. Okay, anyway, so I'm going to sign off now. But before I go, I just want to remind everyone, I mentioned last week, if you'd like to check out astrologer Jackie Slevin's new YouTube show, Planet Speak, I was a guest on that show on November 2nd. We had a really great conversation. We talked about Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen and their divorce, in addition to just all this stuff about the upcoming, at that time, eclipse and the eclipse season and all that. So you can find her show on the Bold Brave TV network on YouTube, and you can check that out anytime. I'll remind you also, if you have any questions about my upcoming class for the Astrological Society of Princeton, I will be talking more about it and get my own sales page up for it soon. But meanwhile, all of the signups are going through the Astrological Society of Princeton, and they, again, are at aspnj.org. So please feel free to sign up, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have before doing so. So, thank you, everyone, for, I was going to say, putting up with me today, because I'm a little bit spacey. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. And please be sure to join me next week on November 17th for another episode of Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go.